Yeah, good morning. So, we begin with Tom Stoppard, and what are the plays we are doing? Dogs Hamlet and Cahoots Macbeth. They are two short plays, but according to Stoppard they are quite interconnected and one cannot do without the other, because that is the idea. Now, a bit about Tom Stoppard. He was born in 1937 and he was born in Czechoslovakia. His actual name is Thomas Straussler. Okay, you can look at the typical Eastern Europe kind of name. And when the Jews were being persecuted in Europe, the family moved from Czechoslovakia to Singapore, where they stayed for a while. Shortly before the invasion of the Japanese in 1941, young Tom fled to Darjeeling, India along with his mother. However, his father stayed back and he was killed during the invasion. In 1946, the family, Tom and his mother, they moved to Britain, where Tom's mother remarried. She married an Englishman, Kenneth Stoppard, and therefore, Thomas Straussler. That is how Thomas Straussler became Tom Stoppard. Okay, his major success came with an extremely famous play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, 1966, which catapulted him to the front ranks of the modern playwrights, international playwrights. And do you know who are who is Rosencrantz, who is Guildenstern? What do? They are from Shakespeare. Are you familiar with the names Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? They are two minor characters from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Okay, and what role do they play? Who are they? A very German sounding names, right? Okay, what are they doing in this play? What are they? What are these two people about? You know Hamlet's story. He is a prince of Denmark. His father has been killed. His mother marries the murderer of her father, his father, sorry, that is King Claudius, who now assumes the throne of Denmark. So, Hamlet has lost his mother, his father, as well as his right to the throne. Now, Hamlet's father's ghost starts visiting Hamlet, and he tells him the entire story, how he was murdered by his own brother while he was asleep in a garden, and how his mother has been tricked into marriage with this treacherous brother of his, and the spirit demands revenge. He urges his son to have revenge. Now, you remember the play within play act we did, the Hamlet stages a small play where he brings in a troupe of players, and they stage something similar to what has happened between the elder Hamlet, the first king and the queen, and on seeing this, the entire scene enacted on stage, King Claudius is extremely perturbed and he walks off in agitation. So, that is the but now after this, once Hamlet is convinced that his uncle is indeed the killer of his father, then he is more determined to have his revenge, and at the same time King Claudius is more determined to stop Hamlet. So, it is a typical revenge play now from here onwards, and he brings in two friends of Hamlet from his university. Hamlet has been attending a university abroad. So, he brings Claudius summons two of his best friends, one is Rosencrantz, other is Guildenstern. They are supposed to aid King Claudius in murdering Hamlet. Okay. However, Hamlet, because the play is not yet over and it is right, this episode occurs right in the middle of the play. So, Hamlet discovers that his friends are planning, they are in league with the king, and somehow he turns the tables on them, and it so happens that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are assassinated and Hamlet comes out unscathed. Okay. So, that is the idea. So, however, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they both of these guys, they appear for a very brief while. Okay. They have nothing much to do in the play. However, Tom Stoppard found the story, I mean this version quite interesting, that what actually happened to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, how did they meet their death? Okay, what exactly did Hamlet do to them? Because Shakespeare is quite vague about these things in the play, because it is not their story, right. In Tom Stoppard's play, Hamlet becomes a minor character. He does make an appearance, but he is a minor character. The play is all about these two characters who from Hamlet they graduate to becoming the leading characters in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. The play was enormously successful, and it has even been translated into a movie with Tim Roth and Gary Oldman, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Yeah, it won several major awards. It even beat Scorsese's Goodfellas. I think it was one of those European awards. So, very successful film. Okay. So, over the next 10 years, Stoppard came up with several successful plays, and major among those are Jumpers, Travesties, On the Razzle, The Real Thing, The Real Inspector Hound, Arcadia, and so on. And then he also translated a number of plays by Polish and Czech writers. His origins are Czechoslovakian, so perhaps that explains. Okay. And he has written this Dogs Hamlet and Cahoot's Macbeth, which we are going to do, and along with Squaring the Circle, another play by Stoppard. So, they are a scathing attack on the Iron Curtain regime of the Eastern Europe of the 80s. Okay. And he is also extremely friendly with actors and playwrights Lech Walesa and Václav Havel from Poland and Czechoslovakia respectively. Both these were actually, Lech Walesa has acted in several movies as well. Perhaps you are not aware of this. And Václav Havel, apart from being the president of Czechoslovakia, he is also a celebrated playwright. Stoppard has also written a couple of celebrated screenplays. One is Despair, based on Vladimir Nabokov's novel, same Nabokov who wrote Lolita, and The Human Factor is based on Graham Greene's novel by the same name. The Russia House with Sean Connery and Michelle Pfeiffer is based on John le Carre's novel. And then Shakespeare in Love. Of course, I am sure you are familiar with this multiple Oscar award winning movie, Shakespeare in Love. And he also did some tweakings in Schindler's List and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. His uncredited screenplay is Sleepy Hollow with Tim Burton and Johnny Depp, and then he wrote a screenplay for Battle, directed by Roland Jaffe, and then also Enigma, which had Kate Winslet in it. Okay, his influences are many, but the major and the most prominent influences are one, Shakespeare. You can see it, Dogs Hamlet, by the titles of the plays, Dogs Hamlet, Cahoot's Macbeth, Shakespeare in Love, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, So, you will find plenty of references to Shakespeare in most of his plays. We are going to look at that also. Then Shakespeare, apart from Shakespeare, the linguist and philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay. We are going to deal with that also, how Wittgenstein influences Stoppard. Samuel Beckett, yeah, the name, I mean, I am sure you are no stranger to this name, Waiting for Godot. Okay. We have seen Pinter, and then of course, yeah, he is also influenced tremendously by Kafka's works, Pinter as well as Pirandello. Now, on Shakespeare, Stoppard says that we always get back to Shakespeare, and he calls him the world champ. The, it's like, he is the heavyweight champion. If all of us are in athletics, then he is the champ, okay, because everybody keeps coming back to Shakespeare. There is no running away, or there is no avoiding Shakespeare. He is miles and miles ahead of everyone. That is what Stoppard says, and therefore his indebtedness to him. References to Shakespeare are made in most of his plays, including Jumpers and Travesties, The Real Thing, The Real Inspector Hound, The Invention of Love, and Arcadia, as well as of course Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. On Samuel Beckett, the playwright of Waiting for Godot, this is what he says. He says, at the time when Godot was first done, it liberated something for anybody writing plays. It redefined the minima of theatrical validity. He got away. It is only too obvious that there is a sort of Godotesque element in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Okay. And when we do the play, you will find that indeed the references, I mean the indebtedness is too obvious to be ignored. Are you familiar by any chance with Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations? Yes, Aditi.
Right, it's a linguistic philosophy with good science. He says that he talks about language as a game and people as players.
Anyone can elaborate on that? Language as a game and people as players. Okay. We will talk about language part of it. Okay. So, Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations, this is what he says, that there is plenty of conceptual confusion on the way language is used, okay, because every word is used to suggest some meaning, right. This is a table, okay, the word for this object is table, and when I say table, we look at it, we do not look at that. Okay, so, as you know, and language is extremely arbitrary. How do you know that this is a table and that's not? Okay, that's the question he raises. Okay, and what happens if we start suddenly, because the entire system is so arbitrary, what happens if we start calling this thing a table and this a board? Quite possible, okay, which is a play in which begins with his acknowledgement of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So, he says that Wittgenstein says that there are plenty of assumptions about language being a set of codes which is used to suggest some meaning, okay. But why? Okay. It need not be that, it may not necessarily be that. So, according to Wittgenstein, an essentialist account of the nature of language is simply too narrow to be able to account for the variety of things we do with language. Okay, we do so many things with language, and the way we understand and describe language is extremely limited. Okay, what we do is to provide a reductionist account of language. This is this, that is it, okay, but why not something else? Okay, and this is the idea that is explored in Dogg's Hamlet. Okay. Wittgenstein says the individual words in language name objects, and sentences are combinations of such names. Every word has a meaning. this meaning is correlated with the word, right? This meaning is correlated with a word. So, the table, a table means something, okay. A flat surface with 4 legs or 3 legs, something like that, okay. So, it suggests a meaning and it is the object for which the word stands, okay. Wittgenstein demonstrates the limitations of this concept. He says we do much more with language than just mean a set of, you know, just use it to define a set of objects. Okay. The traditional concept of language is not sufficient to explain plenty of ideas. Okay. So, there is language presents a limited picture. So, within the Anglo-American tradition, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations is considered by many as the most important philosophical work of the 20th century. And then he also talks about language games in the same book, where he says famously gives the example of the builder's language. Perhaps you are familiar with the builder's language, where he says, I will read it out to you. The language is meant to serve for communication between a builder A and an assistant B. Just imagine a builder A and an assistant, he has an assistant B. Okay. A is building with building stones, they are blocks, pillars, slabs and beams. B has to pass the stones in the order in which A needs them. So, what will the builder do now? He will just call out, okay, beam, and the object will be passed down. He can say slab, something can be passed down, stone, okay, likewise. But then what happens if they decide to substitute these words with alphabets or numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, and still the job is done. So, instead of saying beams, they just say A, okay, instead of saying slab, B, you know, just to save time and for their own convenience, they can devise their own set of codes, and that is, and in spite of that, communication is taking place. What happens then? It may work for these two, but not for others, not for the onlookers. But if the function of language is to encourage communication, communication is taking place for these two. If you remember, even when we were doing Pinter, we touched upon this idea, okay, that language, the way we understand language is extremely limited. It does not cover what we actually do with language. Okay. So, he says that, you know, A, B, C, D, these letters can be used to denote objects. An example of its use, builder A says D and it may stand for slab there and points, and builder B counts 4 slabs A, B, C, D and moves them to the place pointed to by A. The language thus becomes a game for these two. Okay. Others may not be a privy to this language game, and this idea has been elaborated by Jean Lyotard in his book The Postmodern Condition. Okay. We will touch upon that while we are doing Stoppard in detail. Now, I would like to invite Aditi and Krishna, and we are looking at one, you know, an exchange from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and just observe the way language game is at work here. Okay.
We could play at questions. What good would that do? Practice. Statement. One love.
Cheating.
How?
I hadn't started yet.
Statement. Two love.
Are you counting that?
What?
Are you counting that?
Foul. No repetitions. Three love. First game.
I'm not going to play if you're going to be like that.
Who serve?
Huh?
Foul. No grunts. Love one.
Who's go?
Why?
Why not?
What for?
Foul. No synonyms. 1-all.
What in God's name is going on?
Foul. No rhetoric. 2-1.
What does it all add up to?
Can't you guess?
Were you addressing me?
Is there anyone else?
Who?
How would I know?
Why do you ask?
Are you serious?
Was that rhetoric?
No.
Statement. 2 all. Game point.
What's the matter with you today?
When?
What?
Are you deaf?
Am I dead?
Yes or no?
Is there a choice?
Is there a God?
Foul. No non sequiturs. 3-2. 1 game all.
What's your name?
What's yours?
I asked you first.
Statement. 1 love.
What's your name when you're at home?
What's yours?
When I'm at home?
Is it different at home?
What home?
Haven't you got one?
Why do you ask?
What are you driving at?
What's your name?
Repetition. True love. Match point to me.
Who do you think you are?
Rhetoric. Game and match. Where's it going to end?
That's the question.
It's all questions.
Do you think it matters?
Does it matter to you?
Why should it matter?
Why does it matter why? What does it matter why? Sorry.
Doesn't it matter why it matters?
What's the matter with you?
It doesn't matter.
What's the game?
What are the rules?
Now, here we find a very good example of language game. Okay. Perhaps some of you might be familiar with this linguist David Crystal. Have you heard of him? David Crystal, and he's the author of Cambridge Encyclopedia of English Language, and he is extremely fond of this particular exchange. He was recently in Chennai, not very recently, just 5 years back he was in Chennai, and he enacted the entire scene, and he always gives this as an example, you know, whether in person or in his books, you know, this as an extremely fine example of language games. Okay. Now, what are the games? How is language being used here? Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they are somewhere in a place, you know, they are the people who were supposed to aid King Claudius in killing Hamlet. They are just at the beginning of the play we are told that you know, 2 Elizabethans passing the time in a place without any visible character. They are well dressed, hats, cloaks, sticks and all. So, this is their description. Okay. So, these 2 people, they are in some place, okay. They are waiting for somebody, perhaps, you know, they are just bidding their time when they can kill Hamlet. In the meantime, they have nothing else to do. So, they are just passing time. And how do they pass time? Okay, by playing a language game. Just now we were just talking about influence of Beckett. Does it remind you? Are there any echoes of Beckett you find here? Rehan?
I can't actually point out segments, but it's very reminiscent of the exchange in, say, Endgame.
Yeah.
Between the main character who can't stand and the character who can't sit.
Yeah.
They have these sharp, they have these questions, and it's up to them if they want to answer it or not. And most of the time, even if they do answer, they don't really get anywhere with those questions. And it's very repetitive also.
Yeah.
These short, meaningless questions.
True. So, what happens is language becomes a set of repetitions, okay, meaninglessness of repetition, meaninglessness sorry of language, okay, and the employment of non sequiturs. Any idea? Can you, I mean, I think we did talk about non sequiturs in Pinter. What does it mean? It doesn't follow. The exchange doesn't quite follow. One sentence doesn't quite follow the other. Yeah. So, here he actually gives, he says so at one place, right? Is there a choice? Is there a God? No non sequiturs here. Okay. So, don't you think that Stoppard is also doing a little bit of self referencing here? Because by the time the play was written in 1966, Waiting for Godot was a kind of a bible for all these emerging young playwrights. Okay. Now, Samuel Beckett, of course, and Waiting for Godot and Endgame, they have plenty of non sequiturs, and when they say, when Stoppard actually pointedly uses a word like no non sequiturs here, no rhetorics here, no questions, okay, no repetitions here. Actually, he is making a very obvious reference to Beckett and his ilk. Okay. So, this is one good example of self referentiality, okay. And also we have also seen meta theatre, okay, where the writer or an author, he is extremely self conscious of what he is writing. Okay. So, this is what the entire theatre of the absurd was all about, self conscious, self referential, and quite meta. Okay. So, now I am going to invite Abhay for his version of theatre of the absurd.
Yeah, so I'll be carrying on from where Ronak left off last week. I shall be speaking in very brief detail about the theatre of the absurd. So, do you people know what the theatre of the absurd is? Okay, I'll answer that question for you. It's a designation of particular plays of absurdist fiction written by primarily European playwrights in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. Their work expressed a belief that in a godless universe, human existence has no meaning or no purpose. Therefore, all communication between human beings are basically pointless and all communication breaks down. Logical construction and argument generally give way, I mean, in the theatre of the absurd, to irrational speech and illogical acts, leading to the final conclusion, silence and non-communication in the conventional sense. So, absurdism is frequently compared to surrealism's predecessor, that is Dadaism. Yeah, do you people know what Dadaism is? Aditi, you knew something about it.
Yeah, it's like spontaneous. There's also surrealistic and.
Yeah, it's more of a precursor to surrealism. Yeah, I shall speak about it. The aim was basically the destruction of art, or the conventional art of the bourgeois era that had produced the First World War. So basically, they were against anything that they saw as bourgeois because they thought that it would lead to violence and the end of humanity as we know it. And they thought that humanity as we know it, to start off with, wasn't a very good thing anyhow. An example of a Dadaist playwright is Tristan Tzara, whose plays were performed in the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. And he was the first prominent Dadaist author. However, the Dada movement never produced a visible impact on stage, as they were essentially destructive and radical in their nihilism. So basically, when a Dadaist play was being screened, all you could see was destruction, violence, non-communication. It was very hard to keep up with what was exactly happening in any of those plays. So obviously, they weren't huge successes. Yeah. It therefore could not be successful in an art form that depends on constructive cooperation between the audience and the people performing on the stage, because I mean, in every play, I mean, implicitly there is some sort of cooperation between the audience and the people on stage, because the audience are supposed to understand what's happening on stage, right? But that wasn't really happening in Dadaist theatre. They're actually, you could say that they're essentially nonsense poems in dialogue form, and they're accompanied by equally nonsensical business and decorated with bizarre masks and costumes. So at the end of the First World War, Dadaism moved out from Switzerland and split into, you can say, two branches. One went to Paris, and some of the members of the Zurich circle went back to Germany. And the German stream, so to speak, merged and coexisted with German expressionism. And one prominent expressionist of this time is Ivan Goll, who belonged to the antecedents of the theatre of the absurd. He was impressed by the possibilities of cinema, and you can say that he was one of the first people who coined the term art cinema, and he made this movie, or conceptualized this movie rather, called Die Chaplinade, where there is a picture of Charlie Chaplin, and this picture steps out and expresses the farcical nature of the bourgeois era. I mean, it's extremely absurd, and trying to explain it would confuse me and you, so yeah. He felt that the theatre must not just be a means to make the bourgeois comfortable, rather it must frighten him. And how we were supposed to do this, I mean, how he purported that he would do this is by evoking the grotesque without inciting laughter. And this would frighten the bourgeois into being a child again. And he felt that only children see the world as something, you know, real, and not as something seen through a filter. Yeah. The person who came closest to Goal was Brecht. In the course of his development from anarchic poetic drama to the austerity of Marxist didacticism in his later phase, he wrote a number of plays that came extremely close to the theatre of the absurd, both in the case of clowning and knockabout humor, and in the preoccupation in the problem of identity of the self and fluidity. In his one-act farce, The Hochzeit, which means the wedding, the collapse of pieces of furniture basically symbolizes the rottenness of the family in which the wedding is taking place. In exactly the same way that objects express inner realities in the plays of Adamov and Ionesco, as Ronak was mentioning last week. And also, Brecht's plays include humor and gags, which many of these plays didn't, so they were slightly more entertaining to watch on the stage. A slightly more serious play he wrote was Im Dickicht der Städte, which is a serious play, and it means in the jungles of the cities. Basically, it starts off with an extremely trivial disagreement between two characters. The first character is having a fight with another character because he does not like a book that he's written. And he goes and tries to pay this character some money to say nice things about his book. And finally, the fight escalates to such a level that they end up killing each other. Yeah. So it deals with the impossibility of knowing the motivation of human beings in their actions, and this anticipated Pinter, and also the problem of communication between human beings. And this question occupies Beckett, Adamov, and Ionesco. Brecht's personality contained a strong element of anarchy and despair. Therefore, even in his politically conscious era, we saw him project the capitalist world as something negative and absurd, not just as, I mean, how the USSR projected America as evil people, but he said that capitalism was governed by unfair gods who liked seeing people grovel in despair, and his plays were extremely bizarre in that sense. However, Nazism ended up killing the movement in Germany totally, but it continued existing in France, and Dadaism transformed into Surrealism. Whereas Dadaism was purely negative, Surrealism believed in the great positive healing force of the subconscious. Breton, who was one of the founders of the Surrealist movement, had a belief that if you tapped into your subconscious mind and let that sense of automation play, and you gave in and surrendered to your subconscious, you could actually have prophetic powers, and the powers of clairvoyance would come to you. And he claimed that he predicted the Second World War through such powers. Yeah. It must be noted that Surrealism was just not a movement in theatre, but it was a revolutionary movement which took on its shape not in just theatre, but in art, in literature, in most things. One of the original Surrealists, Antonin Artaud, rejected a majority of Western theatre as a perversion of its intent, of Surrealist intent, which he felt must be a mystical, metaphysical experience. Now, most Western theatre generally still kept up with this, that sense of cooperation between the stage and the audience, whereas these people felt that cooperation was not necessary. And while Western theatre consisted of rational discourse, Artois believed that rational discourse comprised falsehood and illusion. Yeah. So there were also other forms of surrealism that have been discussed in Eslin's essay, such as the artwork of Picasso and the general, I mean, lots of these playwrights also had Picasso design their sets, and these sets were extremely grotesque and bizarre, and yeah, it was slightly less, you know, heavy than Dadaism, but still, eventually towards the 60s it started fizzling out. Now, surrealism also manifested in other countries such as Poland and Spain, and one Polish playwright who must be noted is Stanislaw Ignacy Witkiewicz, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, whose grotesque nightmares merge into visions of madmen, and his political parables suddenly turn into hilarious parodies of Polish stories. So yeah, his plays are extremely bizarre. And you must all be wondering whether there were any playwrights who wrote in English, I mean in the theatre of the absurd. The answer is that there aren't any. I mean, there is Gertrude Stein, and she thought that she writes absurdist theatre, but most people in Europe considered her work to just be one-act plays that were actually poetry and nonsense poetry, and her work was not very seriously considered by people in Europe, where Dadaism and Surrealism existed. However, the Western world thinks that she belonged to the theatre of the absurd, and there is some dispute there. Yeah, any questions?
So after that, after that very succinct introduction to theatre of the absurd, I would just raise one question. For example, you remember existentialist philosophy, which is quite connected with absurdism. Okay. However, there is one major distinction between existentialist absurdism and the kind of absurdist theatre which people like Pinter and Stoppard wrote. Okay. For example, this existentialist absurdism as popularized by philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Kierkegaard, etc. Okay, what did they, I mean, they talked about absence of God, okay, irrationality of universe, yes, okay, but in the middle of all these things, human being, however helpless, okay, he was still tragic and heroic. However, in the works of people like Pinter, and starting from Beckett onwards, Beckett, Pinter and Stoppard, human beings are no longer represented as tragic and heroic. What do they become? When you look at conversation like this, is it tragic? Is it heroic? What you just heard, one love, two love, language becomes a game of tennis. Okay. What do they become? What is the position of a human being in this situation? Illogical, meaningless, of course, inconsequential, of course, but comic and pathetic, comic and pathetic, who has no meaning to his life, okay, which is a big departure from the existentialist absurdists, okay, who in spite of all their shortcomings projected human beings as tragic and heroic. So, that is the major difference between the two kinds of writings here. All right. I will just begin with the introduction. I hope you have the play, Dog's Hamlet. Okay. Now, what Stoppard says about the play is that Dog's Hamlet is a conflation of two pieces. One is called Dog's Troop 15-minute Hamlet, and the other play is called Dogs Are Pet. Dogs are pet, and one 15 minutes Hamlet. So, it is a collision of two plays and which he developed into one. Okay. So, he says that Dog's Hamlet derives from a section of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation. We have just looked at into that. Consider the following scene. A man is building a platform using pieces of wood of different shapes and sizes. These are thrown to him by a second man, one at a time as they are called for. An observer notes that each time the first man shouts plank, he is thrown a long flat piece. Then he calls slab and is thrown a piece of different shape. This happens a few times. There is a call for block and a third shape is thrown. Finally, a call for cube produces a fourth type of piece. An observer would probably conclude that the different words describe different shapes and sizes of the material, but this is not the only possible interpretation. Suppose, for example, the thrower knows in advance which pieces the builder needs and in what order. In such a case, there would be no need for the builder to name the pieces he requires, but only to indicate what he is ready for the next one. So, so the calls might translate this ready, okay, next, thank you. Okay. So, instead of saying plank, slab, block and cube, he may use an entirely different set of words. To a casual onlooker, these words do not make any meaning. Okay. However, to the builder and his assistant they do. So, this is just an extension of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation, the description of language he gives. Okay. And this is the premise for Dog's Hamlet. So, we are going to look into it in the next class.